Appendix to Chapter 3, Ethnic Hage. I have no direct experience of the condition in which boat people and others find themselves following their capture by the Australian state, apart from having met and spoken with some refugees who have now settled in Australia. Like many people, my experience is primarily through the media. Most vivid in my consciousness are intimations of caging practices. People behind fences, hands clutching wires, guards. I've seen the films and the photos and listened to and read the reports of government officials justifying the way they handle the situation. Of course, in the well-established traditional pattern of knowledge dissemination, the point of view of the cage from the budgie to the prisoner is seldom or never heard. The government categorizes as non-persons those who have attempted to illegally enter Australia's internationally recognized territories. To many, the image of these ethnics behind cages, for this is how they come across, is shocking. Even if one is supportive of the practices and does not feel particular empathy towards the cage, the practice stands out as extraordinary. Indeed, a nationalist register is sometimes evoked to call this ethnic caging un-Australian. It strikes many Australians as so shockingly other to the Australia they experience in their everyday life. It is certainly different from the tolerant Australia we commonly experience in our everyday life. The reason why the images of ethnic caging can shock an intolerant society is obvious enough. At the most basic, ethnic caging appears as a negation of the historical direction Australia is pictured to have taken within multicultural discourse. Multiculturalism as the historical rise of an ethic of goodwill towards ethnic otherness. If nothing else, multiculturalism encompasses a present struggle by the Australian state to appear to be nice to ethnic otherness, in contrast to a past history constructed as a time when Australia was not so nice. The White Australia policy, assimilation, etc. The then we were nasty, now we are nice polarity clearly structures the imaginary history of multiculturalism and underlies most of its conceptual apparatus. In this context, ethnic caging appears as a historico-ethical reversal. There is, however, a more recent comparative multicultural paradigm within which ethnic caging stands out as an equally shocking phenomenon. Here, the comparison is rather international than historical. It has emerged in light of the atrocities associated with the Eastern European nationalism, particularly with the ethnic cleansing of the Bosnian Wars. This comparison is structured around what is conceived as two radically different types of nationalism, a nationalism of extermination and a nationalism of tolerance. One is an Eastern nationalism, which aims to eradicate ethnic otherness. The other is a Western nationalism, which always aims towards the appreciation and the valuing, and therefore the protection of this ethnic otherness. Clearly, multicultural Australia is perceived here as very well entrenched in the Western camp, while the Eastern camp is constructed as totally other. It is clear why ethnic caging shocks within the above dichotomy. The concentration camp-like images it fosters make ethnic caging appear closer to ethnic cleansing than to anything remotely linked to multicultural appreciation and tolerance. The lack of respect for the humanity of the people concerned, the Cajun bureaucracy set up to deal with the non-people accusations that institutional procedures are not being respected, and that due process is not being followed in dealing with the cage. All of this works to position these practices further in the domain of Eastern otherness. Are these remote northern outposts of Broome and Port Hedland really part of an Australia that wants itself to be so nicely tolerant? How can they be? The government is clearly aware of this image problem, and many of its pronouncements on the issue aim at distancing the nature of the Australian society from what's happening at Port Hedland. Port Hedland is not Australian society the same way refuge seekers are non-persons. At first, this idea of a non-social space inhabited by non-people does not seem like a credible idea. But the message the government intends to convey is implicitly quite efficient and credible. Dealing with the illegal refuge seekers in this way does not reflect in any way on the values Australians hold regarding how their society should be internally structured. The fact that Australians are committed to kill, if necessary, the soldiers of an invading army does not mean that Australian society values killing. If we are willing to be nasty in protecting our nice nation, it does not mean that we have stopped being a nice nation. So the issue raised by the illegal arrivals are shown, convincingly we must add, to have nothing to do with how Australians live their lives inside Australia. Do they have to do with a different set of issues, such as, does Australia have a territorial integrity or doesn't it? Are we a nation capable of protecting our borders, or aren't we? Are we capable of enforcing the international procedures set out for entering our nation, and that are followed by thousands of migrants? Or are we going to allow people to jump the queue? We can see how these questions are clear governmental questions. Are we or are we not in control of the national social space? Although the practice of ethnic caging is morally abhorrent, the government does make sense in stressing that illegal border crossings cause problems for the nation in terms of the issues raised above. What is questionable, however, is the neat separation between the internal problems of a nation, social organization, social values, and its external problems, defensive borders, sovereignty, that is implied by this model of argument. Can we really be nice to ethics and the international organization of the cage and cage them in its external organization without there being any relation between the two? This does not mean the way we treat illegal refuge seekers is bound to affect the way we end up treating ethnic otherness within the nation. My critical intent is more analytical than descriptive. I want to argue that the mode of categorizing and dealing with national otherness in the process of defending the nation from external threats is intrinsically linked to the way national otherness is categorized and dealt with internally. Both emanate from the same structure of categorical and national otherness. They are different deployments of the structure in different contexts. That is, as far as ethnic caging is concerned, the mode of categorization of ethnic otherness implied in the context of perceiving it is an external threat to the nation. It is not at all unrelated to the way ethnicity is perceived internally within multiculturalism. In fact, I want to argue that ethnic caging is best understood in the same way a symptom is conceived in psychoanalysis, a phenomenon which expresses a repressed structure that constitutes and underlies all of the reality in which it is part. In this sense, the category of ethnic caging expresses a structure of perceiving ethnicity, which constitutes and underlies all of Australian society, rather than being external to it. It reveals the whole construction on which the tolerant society is erected. To examine this, we need to make a detour and return to the differences between passive total belonging and governmental belonging that were introduced in Chapter 2. To a certain extent, each of these belongings involves inhabiting a different imaginary of the nation. Governmental belonging, as we have seen, is an inhabiting of the nation's will. Passive homely belonging, however, can be seen as an inhabiting of the national body. All nationalist practices operate on both levels in that they are always attempts at consulting the nation body as a national body and a national will. The degree of emphasis on one of the other is contextual, but the two are necessarily intertwined. This relation between body building and will building is the hardest to conceive. One gains a hint of what it entails by examining a similar relation in the process of the human body's fight against disease, a process which can be conceived, for our purposes, as one of bodybuilding, in which human bodily will is fighting for the control of the human body against otherness and fate. The problem, of course, is that whatever we end up referring to as the human bodily will is not independent of the body. It refers to a capacity of the body to act, organize, and defend itself. The onset of a disease is the onset of matter coming together to form a will other than that of the body, the counter-will aiming to colonize it. The bodily will's aim is to eradicate any such counter-will, an endless job. On the other hand, the more the disease invades the body, the more it weakens the bodily will / capacity to fight it that is inherent in the body. Thus, in the process of fighting against a disease, one can move from a stage where the will of the body to fight otherness is present, and another stage where further quantitative bodily loss to the disease leads to a qualitative loss of bodily will. This is the stage where, without the body actually dying, it is no longer capable of offering any resistance, where the human body's will to fight the disease has ceased to exist. The body becomes controlled by the counter-will of the disease. That is, the counter-will successfully manages to colonize the body and submit it to its own order. In some tribal societies, humans who are still physically alive are pronounced dead precisely when there is no longer a hint of will in the body. This is when disease or death takes over. Thus, for a volitional human body to exist, it is not enough to be alive. It is very hard to understand what this minimum necessary for the living body to keep intact as a bodily will is. It is clear that there is a need for enough of this body to come together in order to order itself and to constitute itself as the ordering principle of the rest of the body, for this willful bodily existence to come into being. The exclamation, "pull yourself together," is a brilliant capturing by popular consciousness of this process in situations where someone appears to be all over the place. The exclamation is an exhortation for the will to take control of the body and order it such that it can stop disintegrating and regain its capacity to be operational. The point of all of the above, of course, is to emphasize that nationalists also imagine their nation to be in need of pulling itself together in order to exist and be recognized as a nation by the international community. As with the human body, enough of the national body has to come together and order itself into a national will that can order and govern the rest of the nation. This is what being recognized at the United Nations often entails. It is this national will which ends up governing the national body. If a national counter-will has emerged, we can also see that the struggle against it by the governmental national will develop in ways similar to the struggle of the human body against disease. This is what nationalist practices, as we have already seen, are all about. There is a point in the fighting against a national otherness which has constituted itself into a national counter-will, referred to often as a national disease, where the fighting is transformed from one where the national will is aiming to stay in control of the totality of the national body it used to govern, to a fight that for maximum necessity for a national will to remain existing and without which the nation is declared dead. This is why, as with the human bodily will, this governmental national will is engaged in a constant struggle to eradicate not otherness as such, but the capacity of any otherness to constitute itself into a national counterwill. In some ways, we say that struggles over the national body are struggles over the kind of life nationals can live, while struggles over the national will are struggles over life itself. One is a battle over the quality of life, the other a battle over life and death. This is why the latter struggle, where the national is more at stake, is often deadlier. During the Bosnian War, when the Bosnian Serbs become nasty, it was not because they are inherently different from us or from anybody else as nationals. It was because what was at stake was the very formation of the Bosnian Serb national will. The Bosnian Serbs were not fighting over who is going to live in my territory. They were fighting over, will my Bosnian national will live and order the nation? So here we have an example of national nation building and turning nasty and deadly. Precisely what was at stake was not the health of the Bosnian national body, but the life and death of the Bosnian national will, capable of governing this body. The quest for ethnic purity is the quest of an ethnic will that is still in formation and still aiming for dominance within the nation. And the tolerance of impurity is the preserve of the already well-established ethnic will, secure in its domination of the nation. Nationalists in the quest of national will are not willing or capable of dealing and coping with other national wills. They exterminate them. When we have a situation where the issue of the national will has been reasonably settled, where the national will has achieved an enduring, although never final, capacity to keep otherness in check, and feels secure in its capacity to stop this otherness from forming a counter-will, national wills are more easygoing with national otherness. This is when they tolerate or not tolerate, accept or not accept, rather than merely exterminate. This is when we get a national managerial parlance. You come here, you go there. I don't mind you living here. We're better off if you live there. At the same time, however, while being more pleasant when dealing with national otherness, the national will is still constantly aware of the danger of the otherness, constituting itself into a national will, and has to ensure that this otherness does not do so, and come to endanger the national will's existence as such. This is why national otherness, even when it is tolerated, has to always be under the threat of extermination to ensure it does not take over. If we take this brief analysis to Australia and examine the way in which national otherness is conceived within it by the white dominant culture, we find another reason why the set of differentiating criteria that Australian multiculturalism operates with in terms of nice, not so nice, nation building, extermination, tolerance, Eastern and Western nationalism are not as dramatically different as multiculturalist discourses would like them to be. White Australia has not, of course, always been tolerant, as the multiculturalists remind us. Well before the caging of illegal refugees, there were many examples of other instances of caging in Australian history. The Australian colonizing national will exterminated and caged Aboriginal people literally and metaphorically, and in exemplary fashion started valuing them when they no longer constituted a communal counter-will in themselves, when they were no longer capable of endangering the British-constituted colonizing national will. More recently, Australians engaged in a massive exercise during World War II of caging and detaining ethnics, including some who actually held Australian citizenship. Why were Italians and Germans who were tolerated in the 1930s and early 1940s detained and caged during World War II? because wars emphasize the problematic of the national will. Many things that are perceived as harmless in peacetime will be perceived by the dominating national will as dangerous for a national survival in wartime. This also explains anti-Arab violence during the Gulf War. The national will cannot cope with the idea of others who may potentially subvert it by acting in the name of another national will. Potential spies, the enemy within, etc. To roam freely within the nation. What I have argued throughout this chapter is that multicultural tolerance does not escape this logic of nation building. The multicultural national will, like all other national wills, tolerates national otherness, but only insofar as this national otherness is in no danger of constituting a counter-will. Indeed, within multiculturalism, we find many examples where the national multicultural will is threatened. Multiculturalism starts to show a rather nasty side. To take the example from everyday life today, it is enough to examine the way the notion of ethnic concentration is perceived and turned into a problem by the committed multiculturalists themselves. Multiculturalists are, of course, always readily admitting statements such as we like diversity or we like ethnicity once they see a concentration of ethnicity. However, it is remarkable how they turn a bit on themselves. As we shall see in the next chapter, some even assert in a matter-of-fact manner that the whole point of multiculturalism is to avoid ethnic concentration or ethnic ghettos. What does too many mean in the expression? Too many Vietnamese living together. Why aren't too many whites living together a problem? Why is the concentration of ethnic otherness a problem? Because, as Elias Canetti initially mentioned in Crowds and Power in 1973, concentrations can produce collective will. For instance, what differentiates the concentration camp from the mere prison at the level of its communal effect is precisely that concentration camps, by being prisons of concentration, imprison and break not just individual members of the community, but also the communal will itself. So otherness scattered around the nation is fine. Once they start concentrating, however, they could become an alternative will, and the national will has to go in and disperse them. Indeed, the multicultural discourse that perceives the concentration as a problem always ends up turning national control over into a problem. Someone else, an other, probably a dark, criminal force, or disease, these are often perceived by collective white imaginary as controlling ethnic ghettos. So what is happening here? A typical national will perceives the concentration a potential counter-will, and readies itself to exterminate it in order to transform it once again into a will-less ethnicity that can once again be more appreciated and tolerated. This is done lovingly from within multiculturalism. We are now finally in a position to deal more meaningfully with ethnic caging. Once the public discussion of illegal refugee seekers, we hear things such as, there's only 60 boat people, 80 boat people, etc. Although people like the person quoted at the beginning of this chapter rightly point out that in terms of numbers, it's nothing, Australia has taken many more. So why all the fuss? Indeed, the question was about these ethnic others inhabiting the national body, it wouldn't have a problem. When we were talking about people jumping the queue, however, we are not talking about people who are merely taking the position allotted to them in their national home. This queue is nothing other than a manifestation of the national will. Having seen what this queue looks like in an embassy located in a third world country, it might not be as civilized as the queue in a David Jones department store, but it is part of the national order, the order imposed by the national will for entering the national body. This is why it is not a matter of numbers, whether 2 people or 100 jump the queue. What they have done is engage the nation at the level of its national will. They have literally tried to subvert the national will. They have achieved something no national can perceive without turning nasty. They are ethnic others who have exhibited a will of their own. That is why they're so dangerous. The natural will does not care about the reason why the other hasn't followed the proper channel set out by that will for entering the nation. What it cares about is that it is a national will and must be capable of enforcing its proper channels, its cues, its order. Otherness must not be allowed, under any circumstances, to show this national will to be weak. You make it shaky, and the national will have to act accordingly. Ethnic caging is not the caging of ethnic numbers, it is the caging of ethnic wills. It is, as the government itself argues, an example for others. Don't try to activate your own will. One will rules in Australia, and this is how it is going to be. As the man falling from the skyscraper in the French film La Haine says to himself, "So far, so good. So far, so good, because if Australia did not have a sizable ethnic population, ethnic caging as a message for other external ethnic wills about the wish of the Australian national will to keep on ruling the nation would be relatively without problem. It is unproblematic, that is, in a world where the condition of the existence of nations has to do with the capacity to enforce national procedures for crossing borders. Australia is a multi-ethnic country, however, and hence this message is not as unproblematic as it may first appear. I do not think that these images of caged ethnics started by referring to having grabbed my attention just as an academic. I think they infected me as part because I was watching them as an ethnic. That is, because the makeup of Australian society, we cannot escape the fact that the message of ethnic caging, even if it is directed primarily at ethnic wills external to Australia, becomes also a message directed at the ethnic wills inside Australia itself. In this process, ethnic caging obtains an added significance which needs to be explored. Caging is a very interesting phenomenon. For a number of years, I have actually been studying the domestication of animals and its relevance for understanding the domestication of people within nations. That is why caging grabbed my attention almost immediately as an interesting mode of nation building. As a result, I would like to refer here to the work of early French nationalist Geoffroy de Saint-Hilaire, who, in 1961, wrote a book on the domestication of animals. De Saint-Hilaire differentiates between three states to which humans can reduce animals in the process of subordinating them to their needs. They can be captive, tame, or domesticated. Captive animals are those who have to be caged or physically restrained to remain subjected to humans. Without this physical restraint, they would go back to the wild unaffected by their experience. That is, captive animals have not yet undergone any major transformation in their mode of conceiving how they should live life. They still conceive the good life, if one can say so, in the same way that they did when they were first captured. Tame animals, on the other hand, have internalized their state of capacity such that the physical restraints are no longer needed as an instrument of subjugation. And their idea of the good life has changed, and they are happy being around the humans who tame them. Caging is no longer necessary to retain them. The difference between tame and domesticated animals is even more important. For de Saint-Hilaire, animals that are tame are always so as individuals of a species. What differentiates the domesticated from the tame is precisely that domestication involves the reproduction of the species in captivity. That is, the domesticated are subjugated in a self-reproducing community of tame animals. De Saint-Hilaire's differentiation of the three states is exceptionally interesting in light of what we have been discussing so far. What is the significance of the difference between captive animals and tame animals as far as our present analysis is concerned? One is tempted to say quickly that captive animals are caged, while tame or domesticated animals are not. There is an element of truth in this, but it is not the whole truth. Tame and domesticated animals are, in fact, often caged. They are not trusted to know that they are not supposed to go to certain places and therefore may need to be fenced in. I think that what is more important than the difference between caged and not caged is the difference in the function of caging. For captive animals, caging constitutes the main instrument of their subordination. Tame and domesticated animals have incorporated their state of subordination. Cages are used to control their movement, to position them within domestic space, rather than as the main instrument of their subjugation. More important, however, what does it mean when we say that captive animals have not changed their conception of the good life, while tame and domesticated animals have? In our terms, it simply means that captive animals still have a will independent of the human domesticator, while for both the tame and domesticated animal, this will has been subjugated to the will of the domesticator. Here is my point. If we can easily recognize in the willful caged animals the willful refuge seeker who has not submitted to the order of the national will, are we not also invited to recognize in ourselves those ethnics who have successfully settled in Australia, the tame and the domesticated animals, whose will has been subjugated as the very condition of belonging to the domesticated space of the Australian national will? That is, by virtue of the absence of a cage to subjugate us. Are we not always post-caged? Mustn't we have undergone a real or metaphorical caging which has shaped our communal wills, such that we can no longer constitute any possible counter-will for the Australian governing national will, as the very precondition of our becoming the subjects of tolerance rather than the subjects of extermination or caging? It is this sense that Port Hedland works as a psychoanalytic symptom. What are these pictures of ethnic caging being offered to us but images of ourselves as domesticated third world looking ethnics? They constitute the very support for the reproduction of the white national fantasy of a multicultural Australia. A dominant culture in which tolerance is grounded in the necessity of ethnic caging cannot possibly produce a politics which counters a racism which sees, in all third world looking migrants, undesirable people who ought to be accepted into the nation. For it is a culture which is merely producing, though through its enacting of the white nation fantasy, the very conception of the third world looking migrants proposed by the racists. The difference is that it argues that, despite this, they ought to be tolerated. When the tolerant says to the racist, I know how you're feeling, but they indeed do know how they are feeling.